Hello, everybody. Welcome to part two of Terms to Define 2024 edition. Okay, so just like I did with the philosophical terms or the philosophy terms, I'm going to be talking first about what I have learned from these terms, and second of all, what I think about these terms, like on a personal note. Okay, so let's start with the psychological ones, which are the ones that we're going to be talking about today. The first one is ego. Okay, so ego, I kind of have a problem with ego because I feel like it's not as bad of a thing as people make it to be. And I've heard, like, for example, Leo on Self Actualize or actualize.org. He has a channel. He's a very good speaker. But he has spoken about ego. And I've also heard this teacher, agnostic teacher, that I was, no, not agnostic. He was, I think, teaching about like the old traditions. Oh, there's a term for that. Are cognizant or something about cognition. But they're like these kind of like religious people, and he was talking about like ego, and a lot of people talk about how the ego is bad. And what I have seen, and also from this, is that they'll use the term ego to refer to like that part of yourself that's a little selfish. And I think part of this problem is with the word, because ego comes from like egotistical, right? Like you're selfish, or egoísta, like in Spanish. You're egoísta if you're only thinking about yourself, right, and not other people. So when people talk about ego, it's very easy for you to connect and relate that with being selfish. Yet I also feel like you have to be ego or selfish sometimes, especially when talking about taking care of yourself, for example, before others. Um, so what I think about ego, and then there's this also like mix up between ego and id, right? It's kind of like the mix up between soul and spirit, like what's the difference? Id and ego. Id in psychoanalysis, for example, is that primitive beast inside of you, the impulsive one, the one that just wants to eat and have sex and sleep, and like the beast that lives in you. And ego, I guess, is sometimes attached to that. People will say like, well, that's just you being selfish, that's just you being egotistical, right? But I think ego, on a personal take, has to do more with like noticing or deciphering what's best for you in life, right? So you have to make a decision, and you have to consider, like I said in my analyzing good video, you have to consider the other person, myself, and you have to consider the short term and the long term perspectives, right? So it's like taking all of that into consideration, and at the end of the day, you have to do what makes you feel good, right? And that's where we get this other extreme of like, always do what's best for you, represent yourself, be proud of who you are. And I kind of agree with that. Of course, you need balance, because if you just focus only on your ego, that's where you will fall into egotistical or selfish ideas. Like people that are very anxious and only live inside their heads and thinking about themselves. Okay, so that's ego. Let's go to archetype. Archetype is a very interesting notion that now I wonder if the zodiacs, I think the zodiac signs are also archetypes. And archetype, I think the most like in layman's terms example that we can think about archetypes is mm, with logos, right? So you look at the logo of Pepsi, or the logo of Coca-Cola, or the logo of Nike or whatever, or Puma, which is like that Puma, and you know what that is, right? So an archetype is kind of like a meme, where a meme is like something that everybody recognizes, right? As a collective society, we recognize certain things, right? Especially culture wise, like when to say hello, when to say goodbye, please and thank you, and like cultural conventions. But also just general notions of things. Those are like cultural memes. Like we get the memes now that are like funny, right? But the word meme comes from that like memory of the collective, right? Um, so in this case, an archetype is something like that, but it's also more symbolic, and it works at a more abstract, deeper, more emotional level, right? Like you take 10 clowns from different parts of the world, and you can extract right? Similar qualities, but it's not that simple either, because it's not all about that. We can say, well, they are all wearing big shoes and big bright noses, but then you'll get an 11th clown from somewhere else that's not like that, right? Like a comedian, right? And we can say, well, that comedian is kind of like the clown archetype, right? So we have these different archetypes. We have the hero, we have the clown, the joker, we have the magician, we have the sage, we have the common man, we have the lover. And at the end of the day, I think the archetypes work a lot in theater, like in plays where you need to play a role. And it's like, okay, what's my role? You're going to be the lover, you're going to be Romeo, and she's going to be Juliet, and you guys have to be the lovers, right? Or you're going to be Romeo's mom, and you have to play the archetype of a mother, right? Or you're going to be the president, like in the series Designated Survivor or House of Cards, and you need to play the role of a president, talk like a president, act like a president, or like in my case, like you're going to be a teacher and you need to put on your teacher shoes, right? So you fit into these archetypes, and that makes it easier to put on the performance, right? Because the archetypes at the end of the day are kind of like for show, right? Like you can't really be an archetype if you're by yourself. I mean, you can, and you can be like, okay, I'm going to be the archetype of a thoughtful man or of a depressed person, or when you're by yourself. But it works better when other people are seeing you do this, right? So yeah, that's kind of what I take away from the archetypes. They're kind of there for us to use, even though Jung, I've just been reading right now in his book, the relationships of the I and the unconscious, where he says you have to be careful not to identify yourself too much, or like for example, when you're healing, right, and after you have healed, to think that you are a magician, right? Because I think you can play these roles, but just like an actor, at the end of the day goes home and keeps his or her individuality intact, his or her humanity intact, doesn't assume that role, doesn't think they are that archetype. I think that's also important to do. So he warns about this. He says, don't think you're the magician just because you have healed yourself, right? Like you may have had healing qualities, healed yourself, you could help others, but you're not that. You're not a healer. You're just playing that part, which I agree. It's kind of like, it kind of makes you like say, oh, like I'm not that cool after all. Okay, the unconscious. The unconscious is this part, and I've made extensive research and videos on this. The unconscious is basically, I can start off by asking, tell me about your one of your fondest childhood memories, or do you remember who Hitler was, right? Or whatever, just anything that has happened in the past. And when you access that memory, that's coming from your unconscious. So your unconscious is basically where everything that you're not using with your working memory is stored, right? And of course, the unconscious is alive, is mixing and matching, right? I've noticed that a lot of the qualities that are used to describe the unconscious are sometimes also used to describe like God or the creator, the absolute. So I find that to be that parallel, I find it to be kind of interesting. But yeah, at the end of the day, the unconscious is like basically this monster that's inside of you, that's directing all of your words, actions, ideas, beliefs. Like just the fact that I'm talking right now, I feel like I'm talking with the unconscious, right? Your peripheral vision is working with the unconscious, right? When you just see something off to the side, but you're not focusing like conscious attention to it. That's also part of your unconscious. So the unconscious is super important. It's super important to take into consideration, and it's super important to also ask of it as if it were something like to give you what you need to solve a problem, or think through a problem or whatever. So yeah, this leads us to self-actualization. Self-actualization in psychology is the idea, I think it may even come from people like Maslow, like Maslow's pyramid, to actually be the best version of yourself that you can be, or work towards that version, right? It's kind of like working towards perfection. Now we all know that perfection is unachievable, because when you're perfect you can't change anymore, and if you can't change anymore you can't grow anymore. So it kind of has to do more with the process of self developing, right? Or self actualizing, than actually getting to the end goal, right? So it's a constant process. Until you die you're going to be doing this. And the way in which you do it is either by having other people that know about it, help you, or by you yourself seeking out this information in books, videos, and with your own thoughts. Like there's this idea that, you know, all the answers are in your head, so are within yourself. The idea is that if you sit there long enough thinking about all this, eventually you will have all the answers. You will see the world for what it really is, right? Now for that I think you would need some time to be able to do it and like really go in depth. But yeah, if you're like an adult smart enough person, I think you can do something like that. And just using your intuition and the life experience you have had thus far, you can probably like come up with some, if not correct solutions to world's problems or your own problems, at least creative solutions to your problems and the world's problems, right? um, so yeah, it's about becoming a better version of yourself. It's about growing. It's about maturing. It's about being more responsible, and it's about, I think, ultimately giving back, right? Because that's kind of like the hero's journey. Like the hero will go through his crisis or her crisis or whatever. They'll grow, they'll learn, and then at the end of the hero's journey, they come back home to kind of guide the next person that will go on their journey, the next generation, sort of say. So that's that giving back, right? That sharing at the end of your road, or while you're on your road. Also, I think it's pretty like a roadmap, like a manual on what to do. Okay, cognition. Cognition. I don't wanna get mixed up with these type of terms like what is mentality, what is mind, what are thoughts, cognition. I've seen that cognition is, it comes from cognizant or something like that, which is being aware. So, but I think it's more than that, because being aware is kind of like attention, which is actually the next term. But cognition is, I guess you could say, like that room, that office that offers all of the potential services in your head, right? Like attention is maybe one of the main offices in that building of offices, right? But cognition is, I think, the ability or the potential for you to put to work, or to put your mind to work, right? Cognition, we could say, is, well, it's not conscious, because conscious, I think, has to do a little bit more with attention. Cognition is a hard one. I'm having a little bit of difficulty defining cognition, and I don't think I've really looked into what cognition is. But again, I get mixed up with like cognition, mentality, you know, because mentality has this other connotation, which could be for like for an ideology, right? Like my mentality is, that we should all live in a just society, right? That's like your ideology, that's your mentality, that's almost like your attitude. But cognition is not really mentality, even though we could say like mentality has to do with cognition. Cognition is just, let's just leave it at that. It's the building of, where all of the offices are, in your mind, where you're able to, you know, execute like the services, right? Like, all right, I need to pay attention now. I need to think now. I need to remember now. I need to process. I need to associate. Like all the things that as a teacher you would have students do takes place thanks to cognition, right? Yeah, like recalling, things like that. Okay, attention. Attention, I always think of attention as like focalized. So it's like, like a laser, where like it will center on a piece of information, on a specific process developing before your eyes. Or if you're listening to it like in your head, or if you're feeling it, right? Like let's say a massage, and you're paying attention to how good it feels, right? Like attention is that. Attention is using your senses to focus on a specific, process taking place, or specific information coming in, right? Now they've talked, I think I have a book, Daniel Coleman talks about the blind spot. No, I don't have it, but I think I've read it. Very interesting. And he talks about how, like in traffic, you're driving, you look at what's in front of you, you can see what's behind you through the mirrors, but there's like, blind spots to your sides, which are the areas that you can't really see. And that has to do with attention too, because when you're focusing on something, just as you are here, the front and the back, but not the sides, um, you could be blinded by those blind spots, and then that can have negative consequences, right? So attention is like attending to everything, right, effectively, in order for there not to, or in order for there not to be bad things happening right after that. Memory is very interesting. They divide memory up into, like, I think, what's it called, like short-term memory, long-term memory, explicit memory, implicit memory, procedural memory. All of those types of memories are interesting, but not to get too deep into memory, let's just say memory is like, uh, what you have in your head, that is like a storage facility, right? So you can keep the information in there, and whenever you need it, you just access it and you're able to use it, right? Let's go with perception. I'm kind of going to go a little fast because I don't want this video to be too long. Perception. Perception has to do, I think perception comes in after attention. So when you pay attention to something, I think you do so most of the time indiscriminately, without prejudice, right? Because you're trying to take in as much as you can. And if you're prejudiced about it, you're going to block off certain things. Now you do that sometimes, but you receive the information, and then as soon as you understand it in your head, you're able to take on a perception, right? And you're able to say, well, that's bad, that's good. So perception is like basically what you do with the information that comes in, thanks to the attention. Learning. Oh wow, learning is an interesting one. Learning, I think, well, supposedly, like in an academic sense, learning takes place when you're able to recall or remember things that were taught to you previously, right? So this could also be in life, when you go through an experience and then people will say you never learn because you're gonna go through that experience again, or you've been going through that experience over and over again, and you keep repeating the same mistake, right? And you're not learning. So I think learning has to do ultimately with the capacity, and I think it is a show skill. You can't just say I've learned something and not use it. I mean, you can, because you know yourself, but to other people, they're not going to perceive that as you learning. So it is kind of like a, let me show you what I've learned. Let me show you what I can do, right? And we can talk about this more in the sense of like showing other people is more of a procedural thing, right? Where let me show you what I learned at camp. Let me show you that I learned how to tie this knot, right? But I also think you learn internally. You learn emotionally, and those type of things you can't explain to people. You can't show people, right? You can only like talk about them, and maybe help, and maybe hope to also help them learn, right? Emotion, they say emotion, and it's actually next to motivation. They say emotion is like the driving force. It's what motivates you, because that's why you will hear words like related, like emotion, motivation, music, right, movement, because they're all kind of like related. Music is movement, music is emotional movement, and it motivates you and things like that. So I think emotion, well, first of all, I think they are biochemical processes in us, in our brain, in our body, in our stomach, that we feel, and they're basically up and about when and doing their thing when either one of two things, when we experience things, right? Like let's say someone cuts us off in traffic, we feel anger, we feel that emotion, or when we use our memory and we remember like, oh, someone cut me off in traffic, and you kind of feel that emotion again, right? I think the emotion is more intense when you're experiencing something for the first time, or experiencing something just in general. um, but the emotion can also maybe come back a little bit low quality, when you're remembering, right? Which I think that's why, like with psychologists, you remember your memories and you're able to feel. But I think at the end of the day, it is what helps us like be human, right? Now, motivation is that feeling that you have that kind of has a correlation with passion, but it's that sensation that you have or that feeling that you have of wanting to act, right? So when you're motivated, you want to act, and many times you're acting, and it's what will keep you acting, right? Now, motivation, I think, it's kind of short lived, but you could extend it. It could extend itself because then we could say like there's this correlation, right? I may even like make a video on it soon, but between that I've noticed between motivation, you start off motivated, you start off going to the gym, first week you're motivated, but like 6 months after going to the gym, you're not really motivated anymore. You're tired now. You're exhausted. You're annoyed, right? And what's going to keep you working towards your goal is not motivation anymore. It's discipline, right? And responsibility and persistence. Now, you can say there are people that all throughout that time they're motivated, and I believe it because I think that's like how high performance athletes or like high performance actors like come about, because they're motivated in the beginning, but they stay motivated, right? And you're not doing it so much because you're disciplined and you're persistent, and you're doing it because you really want to and you enjoy it, and you're motivated to do it, right? Okay, so let's get into behavior. Behavior is what people see you do, right? So it's observable. I think Skinner was the one that said this. Watson also said it. Like it's the observable behavior that you see people, the behavior of this person, take grabbing an apple, right? And then obviously what the behaviorists do is like analyze the correlation between a person saying I'm hungry and then grabbing an apple, right? So it's like cause and effect, and everything in behaviorism or in your behavior has a cause, right? And what you're doing is actually going to be a cause for a new effect, right? Like eventually having to go to the bathroom because you ate, for example, or having to wipe your face because you just ate the apple or something like that, right? What do I think behavior is? Behavior, I think about like, I think it has a moral dimension too. Like there's a correct way to act and there's an incorrect way to act, because I remember, when you're a kid, you get told like don't misbehave, or you're misbehaving, or you're well behaved, right? Or you're a good boy because you behave well. So behavior is ultimately social, and people are always like watching you behave, and they need to know, sometimes because they fear, other times because they want to just simply know that they're around people that are respectful. They want to know that you're well behaved, and if you're not well behaved, even as an adult, if you misbehave, people will like mark that as bad, exclude you, or you know not make you feel like you belong. It's not like people make you feel like you belong anyway, but they'll be harsher on you, right? They'll like ignore you and things like that. All right, personality is what you show other people, right? And I'm gonna get into like I feel like I'm getting into this whole like external internal notions of these ideas. Someone said that life is like the balance between external needs and internal needs, or something like that. And I forget who it is, but like, yeah, personality is like what people see. And I think with people it kind of sticks. Like the first impression they get of you, that's like that's like what sticks, right? So then when you want to show other aspects of yourself, or you develop and change, other people are just going to be like, what are you doing? Or that's not you. But it's like, no, that's me, but it's not who you have seen. So you can't just say that that's not me, because that's not who you have seen, right? So I think there's a personality you show people, but then there's also, in order to understand personality as a whole, you need to also understand that there are there's an internal personality, right? Which is like the way you talk to yourself, the way you treat yourself. So it has to do a lot with behavior, it has to do a lot with what you actually do, and obviously a lot with emotion too, right? Like how you're feeling, how you tend to feel, right? Like your habits. I think your habits ultimately make you who you are. The people you interact with, the type of language you use, the type of way you express yourself. Now, can your personality, or does your personality change? For sure. You're not the same person you are when you're a kid as when you're an old man, right? You're gonna change, and your personality is also gonna change. Now, like in philosophy, they talk about an essence, right? Is there like an essential you, or are you a different you, 80 years later in life? And that would be like a debate topic to get into. I find that to be interesting. But let's just leave it at that for now, right? Development is this idea that you're growing, right? Like I think human development from when you're like a child up to like adulthood is very interesting, right? To see, or your development, like when you start at a new job, and to see how you grow, right? So obviously development has to do with like a cumulative notion, right? Like kind of like building I don't know, like a house or a building, excuse me. And the way in which you develop is like by changing the way in which you act, right? The way in which you behave yourself, which ultimately has to do with learning. So you start somewhere new, like a new office, a new job, and the way in which you're learning affects your development, right? Because if you're like, I don't want to learn, I don't care, you're gonna, it's like a teenager that doesn't want to become an adult. So then, like, well into their 20s, they're still acting like a kid, right? And they haven't developed, right? So I think development is not only necessary in life, but I think it could also be fun because it has to do with learning and the learning experience of life, right? Sensation. Okay, so sensation are the way in which you perceive life, I guess we can say. Sensation has to do with your five senses, right? But we could also talk about like the sense of time, or the sense of space, right? Or like the sense of justice, right? So we have different sensations for different things, right? Like the first one is like visual or auditory, touching, smelling, tasting. But I feel like there are other sensations too that we can perceive, right? As in perception. And then we have a perception on those things, like, oh, I burned myself, that's hot, I'm not going to touch it anymore, right? That's bad. Or oh, that feels good because it's soft, I'm going to touch it, and that's good. um, but yeah, sensation is the way in which information comes in, right? But I think yeah, because even if something is unjust, you're able to perceive it and sense that it's unjust, but you don't really know how that happens, right? Okay, stress. I used to have a problem with stress because I think in last decade, in the 2010s, it became like a popular notion for people to say they're stressed out, even in situations that were just completely like standard, like being at work and having work. It's like, and you're stressed out about that, or being a student and you have homework and you're stressed out about that, or you're in exams week and you're stressed out. So people started to say stress a lot, and I felt like that was a bad thing, and I wanted to stop it. But now I even use it. Like I used to not use it because I didn't, because I think that what you say becomes a reality, right? So now people will literally get stressed out over anything, right? But I think it's because we've been doing this for so many years where we just say that any type of little situation is stressful, so now any type of little situation is stressful, right? But stress is like the tension that you feel when you're trying to achieve something, right? Like the student that feels stressed because they have an exam and they need to study. So it's like that tension. But I also feel like it's motivation to a certain extent because it's what's pushing you. And like how often do we confuse motivation with stress, right? Like, oh, I need to study, and you're doing it, and maybe you're motivated, but you just feel stressed because you'd rather be sleeping, right? And it's like maybe you need to get your perceptions in order, right? The way in which you see things, because that's not actually stress, that's motivation. And it's like that, because I think stress is an emotion, right? It's like motivation, because it's like it's not an emotion per se, it's like a combination of like emotions, obviously mixing with perception, like this is bad, this is good, like I feel motivated, that's good, I feel stressed, that's bad. But it could be like a mixture of emotions mixed with a perception, right, of like that's good, that's bad, of judgment. But yeah, executive functions. So executive functions are everything that goes on in your prefrontal cortex. They are based on beta, I think, beta brainwaves. There are certain hertz in which like the brainwaves need to be in, but it's basically like the executive functions are the ones that are disinhibited or basically reduced or don't function when you're like drinking, right? And that's because you're not able to make judgment. I think it has to do with with making judgment, not exclusively, because you do figure out like, oh, I'm gonna go this way because this way is faster or whatever. This way is gonna take longer. So those are all types of executive functions. When you problem solve, like when you're solving a math problem, for example, you're using executive functions, decision making, right? Those are all examples of executive function. So executive function, kind of like the president, is the one that says yes or no, right? When you need to do something, and it has to do with decision making. I think resiliency, or being resilient, is, I've always kind of thought about it, because I don't know why I get this picture in my head of like something bending and but not breaking, right? So it's like when you're in a difficult situation, and it's difficult, it's hard, but you're able to come back from it, right? You're able to be resilient. So it's kind of like, but there's that notion, right, of like, what if it breaks? What if you get bent so much that it breaks, and you think you're strong enough to take that bend, but you're actually not, and you should just give into it, or find a solution to it. But being resilient, it was very popular for a time, this word, but it's the idea of not being stoic, because you can suffer and express suffering, and maybe like negativity, I feel bad, this is not good. But it's like being in a situation that is difficult but not really changing it, or not being able to change it, right? So you just have to put up with it. But after that, you're like stronger, and that's when people will say like you're resilient, because you've been through difficult situations, but you always come back from them, you don't break, you're healthy, you're sound. All right, schema is a very interesting idea, which basically says that it kind of has to do with perception, but it's like, I've always seen it like as these rooms in your head in which you look at things or view things, right? Like when people say your schema needs to change. Now I may get it mixed up with like perception. I need to really dig into it, because I learned about schema like years ago, but I believe it's this, like the conceptualizations that you have on certain things, right? Like if I talk to you about sports, you have your sports schema, right? Which are like a room of all the things that you think about sports, or your schema on I don't know, office work, right? And you have all your ideas, bad and good, like everything that you have on office work. Or I tell you your schema, like they talk about schemas when you learn a new language and you learn a new word, like literally a new word that you didn't know existed for something, and you need to create a new schema, right? Because you have just learned something that, like when you learn a new language, it's easy to just say, oh, well, office in Spanish is oficina, and then you learn it in English, and then it's office, oficina, and then like that fits into a schema you already have. So you may just even add in oficina in Spanish into your new schema, but you don't need to make a new schema, right? So that has to do with learning, because when you learn something new that you don't have associative qualities with other things, right? You can't relate it to anything, and you just learn it fresh out of nowhere, like it's completely new. You need to create a new schema, right? Metacognition. Metacognition is from cognition, so it's about thinking, but meta means like the next level. So it's thinking about thinking, right? So this is like when you get reflexive or when you think about why you did things, right? Ultimately, it's the why question. Like why did I decide to make this decision? Well, at that time I was thinking that it was a good idea to go into this business, and so you think about thinking, and you can even think about thinking, and just like it can get really crazy. And then we enter like metaphysical or philosophical terrain, which is like for me awesome. But many people get confused when they do this, so I feel like you can't really do it that often. But yeah, when you do metacognition, especially in a conversation or a dialogue with someone, like like the why of the why of the why of the why, that's when you can really get deep into notions, right? And the last one, reflection. And with this one, we're done. Reflection is what I'm doing right now, is thinking about what something means. I would even say it's an attempt to define things, right? So when you reflect, on your past, you're trying to organize it. Of course, it's not exclusive to that. It's not exclusive to organizing things, because you can also just reflect to, like how you would listen to music or dance, like Alan Watts was saying, just for the process, so you could reflect on your past. Like I don't remember where I was watching this, but some guy was in prison, and he said, "Oh, he said like someone asked him like, has this been hard for you?" And the guy was like, "No, I've had time to reflect on everything that I have been through in my life, right?" So it's like it doesn't have, but at the same time, we could say that he maybe was doing it with the intention of organizing it, but not necessarily, right? Like you can just reflect with someone, talk about your days as a child, or maybe if you've been friends with that person for a really long time, and just talk about, what you guys would do back in the day, back in school or whatever. And you're just reflecting, right? But it doesn't have the intention to define it. Like it's just like for fun. So it's the process is fun, but it could have an end goal, right? Like when you reflect as in why something happened, why did I make that decision, or why did this happen? And in that case, you are trying to make sense of it, and you're trying to organize it, right? Which you ultimately do with executive functions with the prefrontal cortex. So yeah, that's it, guys. I just defined all of these philosophical terms and psychological terms. I thought this was important for me to do because I talk about this so much, and I was reading that some philosophers had like these notions, and we didn't even get into other ones like love, or but yeah, I think that would be interesting to do maybe later on, or maybe I'll redo this in a couple years and then see if like my ideas have changed or my mentality has changed. So let me know what you think. If you also have a notion for these uh, terms, or if you have some ideas on what they could be, put it in the comments. But that's all I got for this video, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, peace.